Welcome back. This time last year, who would have thought Florida would be one of the few states to tighten gun laws? But that changed on Valentine's Day when a gunman armed with an AR-15 shot and killed 17 people at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. With just 2 weeks left in the legislative session, the Republican-controlled legislature adopted the first gun control legislation in Florida in years. Among other things, it raises the minimum age for someone to buy a rifle to 21. What it doesn't, however, change is what many believe is a huge loophole in Florida law. If you buy a weapon at a gun store, you have to undergo a background check, but if you buy a firearm from a friend or a relative or from another person, you do not. And joining us for more are Jeff Young, known locally as the gun lawyer, and Carol Rosigno of the Brady Campaign to End Gun Violence. Welcome to you both. And Jeff, let me ask you this, because it would seem that when you're dealing with private sales, be one thing to sell to a brother or a friend, but if you do not know the person and you do not ask the question about whether they are a felon, how do you know or not know there is something really dangerous in that person's history?
Well, you don't, but there's no requirement that you do so. I mean, the way we read the Second Amendment, there's nothing in the Second Amendment that says you have the right to keep and bear arms, but you can't sell them to somebody unless X, Y, and Z. The Constitution gives you a right to keep and bear arms. It's a product just like any other product that is protected by the Constitution, and you should have the right as a free individual, a private person, to sell that to somebody else. Now, as a responsible gun owner, I would advocate, obviously, that what I usually do, and most people do, is they get a bill of sale, they have people sign affidavits, they look at their driver's license, they make them present, oftentimes, concealed carry weapons licenses. So you responsible gun owners are doing that anyway, but as far as whether you have to or not, our position is you shouldn't have
Jeff,
to.
that's the thing. You are a responsible gun owner, but I would imagine not everyone is as responsible as you are.
Well, and if you're not, then you're not going to follow the background rules anyway. So if you make a rule that says a private person must go through a background check, if you're not a responsible person, what makes you think that that person is then going to say, all of a sudden I'm going to be a responsible person and go through the background check? If they're that cavalier with selling their firearms anyway, imposing a requirement on them to fill out a piece of paper and pay a fee to the federal government to do that isn't going to change that person's mind.
We've been asking people on Facebook about this very issue, Carol. Let me read you a comment from Daniel, who asks, there are enough gun laws on the books for gun sales. Private sales are strictly private. The government needs to stay out of our personal lives and enforce the laws that are already there. Your response?
I think that our police chief and the rest of the police department would probably say that every time they try to work with the gun laws, they run into loopholes and loopholes and loopholes, so that they end up getting into trouble. I think what happens is, being cavalier is one thing, and having to follow a law is a completely different thing. So you want to have people have laws. It's part of what keeps us honest as Americans, as citizens of the world. So,
Jeff, I would imagine, and I know you're going to say that none of the major mass shootings that we've been dealing with over the last couple of years would have been impacted about in terms of the private sales and so forth. But there are a lot of people out there who are looking at different ways to try to make them less likely. And if it comes down to at least knowing if there's anything in the past of someone you're selling to a gun to, that might be one of them.
But again, I don't know how you put that onus on a private citizen. There's no law that requires you to do that, and there shouldn't be. As the commenter said, it's none of the government's business who I'm dealing with or selling things to.
Just one Florida county, Orange County, which is in the Orlando area, their county commission adopted a new law just within the last few weeks that require background checks even for private sales. Your response?
Well, my response is that's going to be challenged under the preemption statute. I don't think that they have the constitutional or the legislative authority to do that. The preemption statute prevents them from doing that. And again, somebody just needs to point to me the statistics that show that background checks are going to make a difference. I mean, 60% of gun homicides are suicides or accidents. Background checks aren't going to solve those. 13% of them are gang shooters. Gang shootings. I could venture to say gang members aren't buying their guns from law-abiding citizens or gun shops or going to go through a background check. Only about 1.5% are these mass shooting cases that we see recently, and as was pointed out, background checks were ineffective in every single one of those cases. So you're asking to advocate for another law that simply isn't going to change any gun violence in the country.
All right, we are just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on gun buying for private sales with Jeff Young and Carol Rosigno, but not before we get a check on your first alert weather, so stay with us. Welcome back to the second half hour of our ABC 7 at 7. Tonight, state legislators have adopted tighter gun laws in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, but some say they missed one whopper of a loophole in Florida law. If you buy a weapon at a gun store, you need to undergo a background check, but if you buy or sell a gun in a private transaction, you do not. And joining us for more are Jeff Young, known locally as the gun lawyer, and Carol Rosigno of the Brady Campaign to End Gun Violence. Constitution aside, why, Jeff, is it not a good idea to have some kind of tool or instrument to make sure that if you are selling a gun in a private transaction, that you know whether or not that person is a convicted felon or guilty of some kind of violent crime?
Well, I don't accept your premise because you can't set the Constitution aside. I would argue it is good. As a matter
of public safety.
It is good to do that, which is why, as a private citizen and a responsible gun owner, I do that, as do 99% of the gun owners that I know. It's an individual burden that we take upon ourselves. It is not something that the government should impose upon people who are transacting in a lawful manner pursuant to the way you would transact in any other item in existence.
And that brings us to our next Facebook question. Joanne says, do you oppose private gun sales? And if not, what strategy would you advocate to enforce compliance for background checks and documentation on each sale? Carol.
Well, I certainly don't know the legalities of it, but I would have to say that if a private seller could take that gun or hand that sale over to a licensed gun dealer, take it to the bullet hole, and let them do the background check, then everything is solved. Going back on something Jeff said earlier, there are instances where people have bought guns and done massive shootings. Columbine, all 4 of their guns were bought in a private sale at a gun show. So it does happen. And I think what we need to do is get back to the nitty-gritty of this, change the laws. I'm not saying break the laws. I'm not saying break anything that's constitutional. I'm saying change the laws because something has to happen. Some 90% of Americans want a change in gun laws. They want stronger gun laws. There's got to be a way we can sit down and make this happen, because there's no reason in the world that our country has to be the country where so many people die every year. And I'm not just talking school shootings. There are individual shootings, there are street shootings, there are suicides. As Jeff said, there are many suicides. If we can get a grip on who has these guns by having background checks, which were named after our Jim Brady. The original background checks were passed, I believe, in 1994. We just want them to get stronger.
Jeff, Carol mentioned the polling on this question. Actually, it is overwhelming when it comes to what the so-called gun show loophole, doing background checks at gun shows, including a vast majority of members of the NRA believe that there should be background checks. And I guess the question is, why can't this get done?
Gun show loopholes like nails on a chalkboard to gun rights advocates. There's no such thing as a gun show loophole. What you're talking about is private sales. If you go to a gun show, there are 2 types of dealers there. There is a firearm licensed dealer who you have to go through the background check, and there may be private dealers or private sellers who you do not have to go through a background check. It's not a gun show loophole. It's the same argument that we're dealing with private sales. As far as polling goes, I think the issue is it depends on how you phrase the question and what people are talking about. The concept of background checks, people may think that they feel good, but if the goal is to reduce gun violence in the country, which is what she was just talking about, prior to 1963, you could walk into any hardware store in America and walk out with a gun if you had a couple $100s because there was no such thing as an FFL. Prior to 1993, when the Brady bill was passed, you could buy from an FFL without having to do the NICS check because the system wasn't up and running yet. Yet, we're still sitting here today, as she just claimed, talking about the massive violence and all this gun murders that are going on in the country that are happening now after the background laws have already come into effect.
You're saying we were safer when it was easier to buy guns.
What I'm saying is prior to 1963, for example, you didn't have this type of gun violence. You didn't have this type of mass shootings that they keep talking about. Something in the culture has changed. Guns have remained the same. We still have as many guns in America, owned by as many people as we have since we were founded in 1776. It's only recently that you want to talk about these mass shootings. So something in the society has changed, not the firearm.
Then let me ask you, what has changed in the society? Because some people point to violent videos. Well, those violent videos are sold in the UK and France and Japan, but they don't seem to have the same kind of massive shootings as we do.
You need a whole other hour for me to go in through a list, but it's a variety of things. It's the breakdown of the family. It's the fact that we have bashed and gotten rid of things like God in our schools. The fact that we have bashed Christianity in general, to where thankfully today the Supreme Court came out and said that you can actually have religious beliefs in this country. We have beat down the family. We have broken families. I can give you a list of all of these things.
You're not equating same-sex wedding cakes to an increase in gun violence.
The country as a whole is getting away from the traditional moral values that we used to have, whether they were religious or family or neighborhood values. We have children today that aren't disciplined, that run around, that are crazy. Teachers can't discipline them. There's no spanking anymore. There's no power. I'm not saying any one of these things, but the only constant in our history has been firearm availability, and yet it's only recently that we are saying that we're seeing these upticks. It's not the guns, it's something else.
It is the guns when you consider the power of the weaponry that is out there now.
But that power has been around. The AR-15's been around since the 60s.
We have weapons that are on the streets now, that people have on the streets now, that we did not have. My dad was an Army officer. I was around guns. 90% of the murders in this country are done with handguns, not with AR-15s. That's a myth. 90% of the firearm deaths in this country are handguns, and most of them are gang-related in places like Chicago and California, which have some of the strictest gun laws in the country.
The vast majority of mass shootings are done by, you know,
the majority.
They are.
Okay.
Yes.
Not all of them, but they are. But that's 1.5% of the gun
We're
deaths.
digressing on the issue. So I'm gonna whip out another Facebook question here, Jeff, and I really think you're gonna love this one.
Hope so.
Let's put it up. It's by Mary. Require all over-the-counter gun sales and person-to-person gun sales to attach a physician's release. These mass shootings are not being carried out by well people.
Okay. I don't think there's anything in the Constitution that would allow you to get a physician's release from anybody who buys a firearm. That's about as extreme as it gets. And that demonstrates part of the issues that a lot of gun people have with background checks. As we know, it's not about background checks. It's about taking guns off the street. It's about gun confiscation. It's about passing laws saying who can and who can't have them. The background check is just a slippery slope. It's one thing that they want to do to get to something further.
You're not standing up for the right of people who have severe mental health issues from purchasing.
That's not what I said. You're twisting my words. What I said is there's no requirement for you to get a doctor's note from a person to sell them a firearm. We don't require that for anybody or any other product in the country. It would be completely unconstitutional.
Carol?
The bottom line is we want to make sure that people who are violent criminals, who have been adjudicated as criminals, people who have severe dangerous mental health problems, and that is known, and people who are terrorists should not be able to get guns. If you can't have universal background checks, these people will be able to get guns. And I realize, Jeff, that there are many, many things that people can talk about in the society, but guns are the one thing that all of these things have in common. Why can't we come up with a few things that might work?
Well, I don't think that it is. We have vans that are running over people. We have explosive devices. Guns aren't the issue.
Talking points.
Well, okay. Well, you're giving the Brady campaign talking points, so there you go. The issue is it's not about the background checks. Point to one of these cases. Again, show me one of these cases where somebody failed a background check and was prevented from doing this or not. Every one of these mass shootings that you're talking about passed through this glorious background check system that people say is the answer to all of these ills. It is not. The Parkland shooter passed a background check despite these mental health illnesses that he had. The Texas shooter stole his guns from his parents. He was only 17-year-old and didn't even have to do a background check. The Las Vegas shooter had nothing in his background.
Let me give Carol a chance to respond.
But they went through the background
short
checks.
time left.
I think, number one, I'm not sure that that's true, that no mass shooter has gone through a background check. unsuccessfully. However, I think that when we talk about all of the shootings in this country, because as I said in the beginning, I'm not just talking about school shootings or mass shootings, I'm talking about all shootings. Background checks have been shown to make a difference.
Okay, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. Stay with us. And our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. So, Carol, I'm wondering how would you sum this up for people that, you know, obviously this is not something that the legislature took on this time around. You have some members of the legislature who would like to see it revisited. What would you like?
Oh, I would like to see it revisited, absolutely. There are 10 or 12 states that actually have passed laws to have background checks. Background checks and private sales are so intertwined. I think it is just important to remember that it can make a difference. What we've been doing is not working. It's not working. So I would think that the people who own gun stores would be here sitting next to me saying, she's right. We need to have people go through background checks, buy their guns here. We know who they are. We know what they're up to. Let the private sellers take their
as Jeff
guns
said,
there.
what we're doing may not be working, but when it comes to the issue of background checks, the mass shootings that we are seeing, you know, increasingly, none of them can be pointed out to something that, you know, a failed background check, but the gun got in their hands anyway.
Well, a mass shooting is 4 people or more, and most of them don't get press. So we don't know that. We don't know that some of those people have gone through or not gone through background checks. We certainly know that that's the case with many shootings.
Jeff, you cite the Constitution. I get that, but I would imagine that some people are watching you tonight and just say, what about some common sense here? I mean, you do it, but not everyone does it.
Well, but again, the issue is the Constitution. I do believe that most people use common sense. I mean, look, if you're saying that you need one more law, then you're basically admitting that the over 20,000 laws that we already have on the books, both state, local, and federal, are ineffective. So forgive me if I don't humor you for saying just one more law is going to do it. It's not fixing anything.
It is making sure that somebody who is purchasing a firearm does not have a felony.
But the goal, the overall goal, is to reduce gun violence in America. There is no evidence that background checks have done that. We have had them since 1993, and yet everybody is talking about how things are worse now than they've ever been. Pass a law that's effectual, and maybe we'll get behind a common sense law like that. If it's not effectual, let's not do it.
They have worked.
Then why are we up here talking about how bad things are if they've been in place since 93?
We have to leave it right there. FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, that's because it is expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. Jeff Young, known locally as the gun lawyer, and Carol Rosigno of the Brady Campaign to End Gun Violence.